should stay into the EU, should become a member of the EU, and what implications this may mean. So in the 1990s, the EU commissions also a number of studies. I am aware at least of 3 studies, 2 done inside the European Parliament in 1997, and 1 done inside the European Commission in 1999. There were internal documents for basically for various committees. The Parliament one were for 2 parliamentary committees, and the Commission one was commissioned by the President of the European Commission in order to have a bigger picture of what was going on about Islam in Europe and to decide whether some particular policies should be transformed because of this. So the 1990s have these internal, external events, but inside Europe or in the immediate borders of Europe that are affecting and questioning Europe. And Europeans are very skeptical about Turkey because there is a beginning, the mid-1990s, if you remember, are when the first wave, in a way, of the second wave of the Islamist parties begins to appear as a strong political force inside Turkish politics. So Europeans are worried not so much that, yes, another large country is going to join Europe and to sociologically affect the characteristics of Europe because you have more Muslims into Europe. It's more this political aspect. These reports are actually questioning what they call the fundamentalism of Turkey. If we have Turkey in, are we going then to import not just Muslim people but Muslim politics into Europe? And is this going then to maybe affect the large numbers of Turks who live in Germany who may then will want to start pledging loyalty politically to these Islamist parties rather than to German parties? So this is the big question. And the culmination of these small crises that are adding up, small crisis about Islam, there is no one single solution or one answer or one policy about Muslims at that particular stage, but you can see that the concern is building up in different fields of EU policy, the external relations, enlargement issues, migration issues, social affairs, integration and so on, migration policies. Then with 9/11, obviously, we have the culmination of the threats that were underlying some of the concerns. Now, what is surprising is that this move towards accepting, the move of what is behind what is now this Article 16 of the Lisbon Treaty, which encourages basically religious groups very broadly to engage in dialogue with EU institutions and implies that perhaps the EU institutions are going to listen to the interests and the claims of religious groups, all of them, happens exactly in this period of crisis, but it's coming from another angle. It's not coming from those policymakers who are involved in devising security strategies or migration strategies or integration strategies. No. It's coming from something completely different. Basically, the Christian churches, who had been positive in general in the 1950s about the pacification of Europe, had grown more and more skeptical of the little space that the politicians had left to them. And throughout the 1970s and 1980s, they kept lobbying the Brussels politicians to try to carve a little special space for Christian groups, so that when big ethical decisions are made, then the Christian voice, the Christian values are heard, in order to have these, to avoid the over-secularization of European policies, in order to inject basically these Christian roots, to keep the Christian roots inside the European political project. And they failed. The European churches tried very hard, and partly managed to participate in the consultations until in some private consultation, as long as the law was there, because he himself was particularly open to the Christian tradition, he was brought up in that sensitivity. So as long as the law was there, there was a small opening in the late 1980s to the issue of religion in general, because it was part of this bigger reflection of what kind of future do we want for Europe, what kind of identity should Europe and Europeans have as we move ahead towards a broader and a deeper Europe. So he had this bigger concern, and he happened also to be particularly sensitive to Christian issues, so he invited, on a very private basis, ad hoc and private basis, he invited faith communities of all traditions to participate in these consultations, which were in a way an end for themselves. They were not supposed to continue. What happens is that the Lord finishes his mandate, these big crises continue, and the churches have got this special, this opening to the EU institutions and begin to lobby particularly hard in the course of the 1990s, until they managed to have a small clause added to the major treaty of 1997, the Amsterdam Treaty. And this clause is a statement very similar to the wording that we find now in the Lisbon Treaty, in this Article 16. So the wording of Article 16, the wording, is borrowed from this wording that had been added by the Christian churches, in particular the Catholic groups, when they were trying to make sure that as the EU was broadening in scope and clarifying in detail what were the policy areas, it would not forget about the Christian roots of Europe. What happened afterwards is that with all these issues happening in the 1990s that are actually, they're not about Islam, but they are about people and political events that are concerning Muslims, we have that actually the EU institutions become gradually sensitive to the issues raised by the Christian groups, but because of the problems coming up from the Muslim side, from these perspectives, these policy fields that are affecting Muslim communities. So by the time 9/11 happens, the European Commission in particular, but the EU as a whole, has some tools available to respond to the crisis and to begin to project a voice that is not the same voice as the war on terror that is projected from the US. And the EU basically has a repertoire of words, of ways of understanding religion that has developed for these multiple intersected reasons in the previous 2 decades, and is now available for the EU institutions. So you can see that immediately after 9/11, the Prodi, who was then the president of the European Commission, invites Muslim communities and other faith communities to these interfaith dialogue things. And there is a production of discursive production about Europe and its position about terrorism and its ability to make nuances and to distinguish terrorists from Muslims. That is particular of the EU and you don't see in the US. I'm not saying that this is true. I'm interested in the fact that the EU develops this kind of discourse and tries to play politically and to differentiate itself from the US because of this interest in intercultural dialogue, in interfaith dialogue. And what I'm arguing, what I think, is that these increased activities of faith-based groups actually increased sharply after 9/11. So instead of having less discussion about religion, you have more discussion about religion and more inclusion of religion. Not more discussion of religion as demonization. You have the EU institutions talking more about religion and producing more and more activities that are relevant to faith communities and try to involve many faith communities, especially Muslim communities. So basically, these resources and these linguistic and policy resources that are being initiated very slowly by the Christian churches, the push from the Christian church, the opening on the part of the institution, the ad hoc, infrequent meetings initially established by the Lord, who believed in the relevance of religion. He did believe. All these are borrowed by a number of politicians and institutions who actually probably do not believe in the relevance of religion on a personal spiritual level, but they have understood the policy relevance and the trick that incorporating religion does by in solving or at least showing that you are trying to address some crisis. So basically, the discourse about religion, about interfaith dialogue, about intercultural dialogue, in particular, it's basically becomes an instrument to deal. It's no longer just a value as it was for the law. It becomes an instrument, a political instrument, policy instrument to address or pretend to address issues about Muslim communities. And so we can see that in, for instance, I give you some examples of the multiplicity of policy areas that all of a sudden, after 9/11, especially after 2005, after the bombings in Madrid in 2004 and the bombings in London, you have a huge development of policy documents in, for instance, in the area of migration and integration. You can see for the first time in the early 2000s, documents acknowledge that the path to the integration of migrants is about also recognizing their religious traditions and helping them to practice their faith, which was completely absent from previous documents. So this is inside the domestic policy issues of the EU. Externally, in the Euromed relations, you can see that religion had been already identified in the mid-1990s as one of the characteristics to bear in mind when Europeans want to if Europeans want to develop this special relationship with the immediate neighbors of North Africa and the Middle East. But actually, after 9/11, this interest in religion, what religion of the Middle East? Islam, of course, becomes a central core. And it becomes basically the interest in religion becomes also a way to tackle the problem of radicalization, or that is presented as a way to tackle the problem of radicalization. And you see a gradual shift in the discourse, but also in the practice of the policymakers who, for instance, in the late 2000s, around 2007, 2008, you see that the US is still going with its list of the Islamist terrorists, and the EU is having private, secret talks with members of Hezbollah, of Hamas, not official talks, but basically there are conferences where EU officials, which EU officials are attending, and which are funded by the EU and are organized by university like yours or like mine, and then the EU officials come to listen, and then in the coffee break they manage to speak to these radicals. So there is a major shift that is produced. I'm not sure if there is a deliberate decision, but basically there is this language shift produces a number of transformations in the way in which the EU deals with Islam and religion more broadly. Now this opening up to religion is not coherent. Let me see if go down to the slides. This opening up to religion is not coherent because basically you have, so it's the second point, these EU policies that are not officially spoken of as policies towards religion or towards Muslims. They are policies about social integration that recognize the relevance of religion, Islam. Policies against radicalization, security issues that recognize the relevance of respecting and understanding the needs and the claims of Muslim communities and so on. Policies about the neighborhood, about the Middle East, that recognize that maybe the EU has been indeed too ambiguous about the autocratic governments, and maybe these Islamists like the Muslim Brothers, like Hamas, maybe they have something to say that is worse. So you have this gradual opening up, but also you have this contrast whereby domestically the relevance of religion takes a positive side in this field of integration of Muslim communities. And basically Islam and other religions are perceived as sources of values and of cohesion for society. They produce social capital for society, and so they ought to be tapped into, and they're beneficial. But then you have the studies around radicalization that are much more ambiguous, and they think that yes, you have to understand Muslims, but also you have to check them because there is something wrong with this religion inherently, and so this is the discourse that is going on. And then there is this conflicting position of the EU, whereby in the course of the 1990s, it is very ambiguous. The EU is internally begins to be more responsive and understanding to the claims of Muslim communities, but keeps a very strict and single-minded approach towards the claims of Muslims in North Africa and in the Middle East. And basically this position only changed after 2011, after the Arab Spring. The EU has kept it, although between the lines and behind the scenes, policy officials have engaged with this. What does this mean for the bigger interest that I started off with about this political system of the EU and the role of Muslim communities in this political system, and what does this political system do for Muslim communities? Well, and here I have to go back to the earlier slides I wanted to show you. As I've described until now, the EU, Islam has become a salient issue, as an issue, in many policy fields for national member states, but also for the EU institutions. And the EU institutions have gone as far as to even include this particular treaty, and having official meetings where you have the President of the Parliament, the President of the European Commission, the President of the Council meeting together with the leaders, the religious leaders. This is problematic because it shows the contradiction of the different facets of the EU policies and the limited scope within which this interest in Islam has been, and the contradictions within the different policy areas. But it also shows us that the EU is, by organizing these meetings, is still operating very often within an understanding of religion that is very traditional, very European, very old. That is, when you invite the religious leaders to speak with the President of the European Commission,